Welcome to Kahwa, Children of Adam and Hawa, on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special radio show for the month of Ramadan, brought to you by Adil Khan and Hamdi Blekich, in collaboration with Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue, where we are speaking to our special guest today, Professor Ed Umar Moad, Professor of Philosophy at Qatar University. Hello, Umar.
Hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you begin by telling us something about yourself, please?
Well, like you said, I'm a professor of philosophy at Qatar University. I was born in Missouri, and I went to university.
Where is Missouri?
Missouri's in the United States,
okay.
In the middle of the United States.
Okay.
And I studied philosophy in university. After I got my bachelor's degree, I read translation of the Quran and converted to Islam, and then I went on to graduate school and got married, have 5 kids, and now I find myself in Qatar teaching philosophy in Qatar. Alhamdulillah.
Great. Why would anyone want to study philosophy?
Well, people like to study philosophy because certain people, I think, like to question things more deeply than the norm, and philosophy is a discipline that tries to look at every aspect of life without any presuppositions, without any unquestioned answers, you could say. So philosophy appeals to a certain type of person. Philosophy means love of wisdom in Greek, so I suppose it might be innate to everybody. I don't know. But
and in an old Islamic tradition, we've had the tradition of philosophe.
Yeah.
But hasn't the door to philosophy closed in the 12th century as is popularly conceived in Islam?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, and I'm not really an expert in Islamic history or Islamic intellectual history enough to really have a firm, committed opinion about that. But I think a lot of confusion comes down to the concept of philosophy, actually, because like you said, there's a falsafa, which specifically really refers to a certain collection of philosophical doctrines that some Muslim philosophers had, influenced by Aristotle and Neoplatonism in the classical time. But philosophy really is something broader than that and much more basic than that term really applies to. So sometimes when people talk about philosophy historically in Islam, they really talk about, say, the fate of certain specific doctrines or certain specific philosophical schools of thought, which we call falsafa. But if we really look at philosophy, or deploy the concept of philosophy as it is, just love of wisdom in the deepest and broadest sense, then arguably there might be many things which have occurred in the history of Islamic ideas that are actually philosophy but are not called so because they don't fall within that very specific category of Aristotelian thought. Yeah.
But wisdom can be expressed in many forms, I guess.
That's
in
right.
Poetry, in literature,
That's
in
right.
music.
Yeah, so in my opinion, a lot of disciplines in Islamic intellectual tradition could probably be considered philosophy, or at least philosophical. So, usul al-fiqh has a logic behind it, and there's a kind of a philosophy there. And I think when you look at Rumi and Islamic poetry, there's a lot of philosophy expressed in there. Now, and a lot of Muslim thinkers are very philosophical, but would be very against what they called as the philosophers, which for them meant, maybe a more radically rationalist, from their perspective, school of thought influenced by Aristotle. So nowadays in modern times, when we talk about philosophy, many people are considered philosophers under that category, even individuals who believed that philosophy was useless. Right? They were sort of anti-philosophers, and we study them in philosophy. and that is also considered a kind of philosophy. So even to oppose philosophy and to make a refutation of philosophy or to attempt a refutation of philosophy ends up being a philosophy or ends up being a philosophical enterprise.
So wasn't the old debate about reason versus revelation, and now it's science versus revelation?
Yeah, there's some difference there. That's right. I think that the first thing that comes to mind when you bring up the difference is just that now we have a more empirically oriented paradigm that is put into juxtaposition with religious belief, whereas previously it was more of an a priori, with just basically a logic or more philosophical paradigm that was juxtaposed against religious belief.
But is there an attempt to bring the two together by some thinkers in Islamic history or in other traditions?
Of course. I mean, basically I think almost all of religious thought, whether it's considered to be or called as philosophy specifically, is inevitably a rationalization of religion. Everything that, in order to be understood, has to be made sense of, right? And every scholar of Islam or a scholar of religion generally is ultimately trying to understand his religion, trying to make sense of his religion. So I don't see how actually religion and reason can ever actually be separated, despite what some people say on one side who look down at religion because they think it's essentially anti-rational, and also on the side of some people who think that they're very, very pious or fundamentalist by claiming that reason has nothing to do with their religion. And I think that's not possible. Even the person who claims that they don't let reason to play any role in their religious views or their religious thinking is obviously wrong, because they are thinking, right?
And we know that thinking is highly encouraged in the Quranic paradigm. But can there be a type of thinking or questioning which can lead to deviance or unnecessary distraction? Can there be negative thinking and negative questioning?
Yeah, thinking actually can lead to deviance and unnecessary distraction. But at the same time, without thinking, there's no way to know the difference between, truth and deviance, or what's important and what's an unnecessary distraction. So, right, if we're closely identifying philosophy with thinking, which I think the argument really is there, right? If you're against philosophy in the real sense, you're really against thinking. And without thinking, you can't really even distinguish between the truth and the error in the first place. So, it's correct. When you're thinking, the danger is that you might think something wrong. But without thinking, you won't ever think anything true.
But how can one discipline one's discernment to differentiate between truth and falsehood? Is that where philosophy plays a role?
Well, philosophical education can help in that. So anything that sort of exercises critical thinking, any practice in thinking, any amount of considering different viewpoints and evaluating them really engages the mind and increases the person's ability to discern through their reasoning faculty. I think what Islam adds to this mix is that discernment of the truth from the falsehood also requires a kind of moral faculty or a moral awareness. So it is the case, and it's true that in my belief, critics of the over-rationalistic perspective on life are correct when they say that a person can be very intelligent rationally and at the same time miss very important moral truths and turn out to be bad people. Right? There have been very intelligent and rational evil people, right? And this is the case. So our epistemology, our ways of knowing, are more than just reason. It includes reason, but also spiritual, moral faculty, which requires other practices, religious practices. Right now, we're fasting in Ramadan, doing our prayers, and those kind of things. And the understanding of most Muslim scholars, most Muslim thinking that I've read, serve to, strengthen those faculties for gaining knowledge, which are also necessary. So these have to be both combined in a holistic way, and not neither one of these sides of the coin shortchanged in our lives.
And you are listening to Kahwa, Children of Adam and Hawa on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special radio show for the month of Ramadan brought to you by Adil Khan and Hamdi Blekic in collaboration with Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue, where we are speaking to our special guest today, Ed Umar Moad, Professor of Philosophy at Qatar University. Professor Umar, what is, in your view and in your experience, philosophy? The experience of philosophy in your everyday life. Is it a discipline or is it a way of life?
Well, it's both. Because, it's my job teaching philosophy. Part of my career then involves teaching and publishing, like any academic. So in that case, it's an academic discipline. But it's also a way of life. And I think it's possible for somebody to be an academic philosopher, or let's say, work as a faculty member at a university in philosophy and not necessarily be philosophical. And it's also possible for a person to be very philosophical in their way of life and not pursue philosophy as a discipline or a way of making a living. So it's both, but I think the most important for me is that philosophy is a way of life. And so I'm happy to have a job that sort of coincides with my way of life, I guess.
And for those who want to study philosophy or who are already studying philosophy, where can their skills be applied in life in general?
Well, thinking about examining your own life and thinking about the meaning of it, right? And asking yourself what's the meaning of whatever you're doing and try to fit that in to some overarching conception of what your life means and what it's about is really, really important. And that's, I think, the core of the philosophical way of life, or that's the core aim of it. So that being said, any aspect of life can be thought about philosophically. One of the things that studying philosophy helps you to do is to think outside of the box and to question assumptions that may not be easily noticed by people who aren't used to thinking philosophically. So when you start thinking philosophically, you realize that there are a lot of assumptions that we go along with in life which we don't question and we don't notice. And sometimes questioning those assumptions can really open us up to a whole range of possibilities as regarding how to approach any kind of problem. So if you're having any problem, and then life is a series of problems, whatever discipline you're in, if you're in business or if you're in medicine or if you're in engineering or whatever you're pursuing, you basically are faced with some kind of problems that you need to solve. And sometimes the best solutions can be hidden from us because of certain assumptions that we have that we don't notice. And when we are able to actually examine the way we think and examine the possibly unnoticed assumptions that we have, like I'm saying, the many more possibilities open up to us, and that really opens up the potential for innovation, for new ideas, for better solutions, for better ways of doing things in all aspects of life, whether it's something which has to do with your business or career or the material, and also whether it has to do with your spiritual life, how you conceive yourself and how you understand the meaning of your life and how you relate to people around you and so forth.
If you'll allow me a naughty question.
Uh-oh.
Can you come up with arguments against studying philosophy?
Yeah, there are plenty of arguments for studying. I mean, like you said, it can lead to deviance and unnecessary distraction, as you put it. So, but, I don't know if that's a good reason not to study philosophy. Or let's say it's not a good reason not to be philosophical. There may be good reasons not to study philosophy depending on, the contingent circumstances, like who's your teacher, and right, and how the class is being taught, and that kind of thing. So this is something that brings with it a lot of considerations.
But in your own life, have you ever noticed that there's some areas where you'd rather not ask questions sometimes?
Yeah, I think so, of course. But perhaps the areas that we would rather not ask questions are the areas that we mostly need to ask questions.
You ducked the question, but we let you duck that question. How has philosophy helped in your own personal journey to discover Islam and the depths of Islam?
Well, this may relate to the last question that you said I ducked. Like I said, I studied philosophy before I was a Muslim. I got my bachelor's degree. And I think that in the course of my life, how things turned out, studying philosophy really did cause me to ask a lot of questions which probably people would feel uncomfortable asking. At any rate, I ended up at a place where I didn't really see that there was much, let's say, solid reasoning behind most of what people believed and thought and how they lived. So in terms of values or in terms of ideas about the way the world is and what life is about, philosophy at that point left me with quite a wide open, let's say, vacuum, right? And so it was at that point that I read the translation of the Quran, and I had this experience from reading it. And I do think that the experience that I had from that, which caused me to become Muslim, or was my becoming Muslim, my process of becoming a Muslim, the way was made open for that by philosophy having been able to sort of clear the space, so to speak. Yeah.
Would you say that you had a Ghazalian moment? And Imam Ghazali is the 12th century thinker,
right,
who is known for Islamic theology and who has written many great works on Islamic ethics and theology, and who had a moment like that. Perhaps you can explain a bit about that moment yourself, Ghazali's moment.
Right. Yeah, I guess I if I wanted to flatter myself, I could say that it was somewhat of a Ghazalian moment, as he writes about in a book called Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. But I don't think that I've sort of followed through on that moment to the extent that he has to become a person or a Muslim of his spiritual stature. I'm still struggling with my nafs and the whole journey that he lays out after that for the person who wants to improve himself as a Muslim. But yeah, the experience that Ghazali talks about as one of realizing when he's young that everything that he believes is basically a result of accidental facts about the community in which he was born and what his parents taught him. And he mentions that he realizes that he notices that the children of the Jews grew up to be Jews, and the children of Christians grew up to be Christians, and the children of Muslims just grew up to be Muslims for the most part. And he began to then realize that he didn't really have any ground to stand on in his beliefs, because the basis of his beliefs was no different from the basis of the beliefs of the other people who just believed what they were taught when they were young. And so he began to question and look for a way to discern what was really true from what was really false. And that led him to a state of skepticism where he, didn't really appear to be able to form any beliefs at all, because he didn't find any grounds for it. And then it's after that he describes it, a spiritual experience, which he describes as Allah casting a light into his chest and healing him of this doubt. And after that, Ghazali has written many books which have been famous and sort of, I would say, when I read them, also help to sort of found a kind of a intellectual basis for religious belief, right?
And is there a strong argument on another tack for religious freedom in Ghazali, given his own experience? Does he kind of give reasons for us moderns to have faith in religious freedom, to encourage religious freedom, perhaps not directly, but indirectly? No,
there is something there, and there's some ambiguity in it too, and it relates to some things that I've thought about recently about this. We do seem to have sometimes a apparently mixed messages, right? About religious freedom, and the Quran tells us that there's no compulsion in religion, and it also tells us we're told by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the deed is judged by the niyyah, right? And about the importance of ikhlas, and it seems that for ikhlas to be in a deed of an act of worship or in any kind of deed, it has to be done by free choice, by voluntary an understanding decision on the part of a person who can make such a choice. So, and at the same time, though, we find ourselves sometimes in, it seems, a social structure which doesn't allow very much freedom. And we have in Muslim societies a great deal of, let's say, social pressure and other kinds of consequences that would come to a person if they were to stray in their beliefs or thoughts or question the prevailing, doctrine or belief. So there's a tension there. So I've been thinking about freedom in Islam recently, because I think that it is something which is more important than we Muslims have been taking it. But at the same time, I think that it's something different than what it's typically, how it's typically understood in the West. But these are thoughts which I haven't really finished thinking through yet. So it's something which I would like to, have some conclusion on, actually.
Some temporary closure.
Yeah, yes. It would be nice to hear what other Muslims have to say about it. But unfortunately, a lot of times now I find you hear Muslims, when they're discussing things, they're in an apologetic mode. Like they're speaking to the Western audience, right? And so sometimes I feel a hunger for a sort of real, honest discussion between Muslims about issues like this, which don't have to do with public relations or anything like that, or proselytizing or anything.
Well, arguments can be made from both sides of this debate, surely, because religious resources give us ample evidence that the Prophet's life is all about overturning his ancestors' beliefs and his ancestors' worship. Mm-hmm. And throughout Islamic history, we have people who come and renew that tradition, but at the same time, we have many who claim that there has to be a strong sense of following, at some level, a blind sense of following to the values of the forefathers. So that tension is what you're talking about, I guess. Yeah.
It's true that the first Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the first Muslims had to resist and let's say leave the social paradigm, the social structure in the community that they were part of, in order to become a Muslim, right? And this was an act of bravery, especially in a very tribal-oriented environment, right? A person who would leave the way of life of his people puts himself in a very vulnerable position, in those circumstances. Now, in a modern society, in a modern liberal society, it's very easy. When I became Muslim, I don't have any issue or any real danger for myself, because it's the United States, and the culture is very open, and people can convert to different religions, and usually they don't face dire consequences. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to. It's not the case that Islam is. Let's say is people came to Islam in the beginning by rebelling against their own social structures and societies, but it's not the case that Islam is just about rebellion, right? So there's a Western ideal of freedom which you can personify as the rebel without a cause, right? Well, in Islam, maybe sometimes you have to rebel, but it's not without a cause, right? And the cause just isn't simply rebelling, but it would be for a specific truth. So, now, in the Quran, when it says that there's no compulsion in religion, immediately after that it says because the truth is made clear from the false. And I think that those are tied together the fact that they're tied together in that verse is very important. It points to a distinction between the Muslim concept of freedom or an Islamic concept of freedom, which I'm still again clarifying for myself, and which generally may be a Western style concept of freedom.
I guess the kind of lub of the question, or the core of the question, is around the concept of tarbiyah, which is training or education, or what should be the values for tarbiyah, and how can tarbiyah lead to an open-ended, sometimes, avenues. Tarbiyah which is not completely closed or foreclosed.
Yes. Yeah.
Would you agree? Or
yeah, I agree. I mean, education, when it's really education, it allows somebody to embrace a truth which they can recognize on their own, and then freely embrace based upon that actual recognition that they can, that they're capable of. So education should be opening somebody to facts, to truth, so that they can actually see it for themselves, and so that it actually does become clear. And that's quite different from training in the sense of kind of a propaganda style of brainwashing, you might say. That's a totally different thing. But I think in modern times and in modern societies, and a lot of times, education turns into a process of training or propaganda or brainwashing, right? And sometimes I think in the Muslim world we tend to think of education in that way, in the wrong way. And so, yeah, to sum it up, freedom is an essential part of proper education, and learning has to be done freely. People have to understand what they're saying and say it because they understand it, and they understand it to be true by their own lights, and not because they've been trained to repeat something which is only external and only to get by. Would
you like to give a parting message for Ramadan to our listeners?
Yeah, Ramadan Kareem. Thank you very much for listening to our show. And, if I said anything that upset you, remember, you're fasting.
So, on that note, we leave with some parting thoughts from this most inspiring session we've had with Professor Ed Umar Moad. He's asked us to examine our lives. He's asked us to learn to be educated freely. And perhaps there are good reasons for reason to prevail, but the best ones are those that feel true. From Adil Khan and Hamdi Blekic, goodbye and Ramadan Kareem. Thank you.